Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event on the opportunity for food companies to reduce livestock methane in the supply chain. I'm Meryl Richards. I'm Director of the Food and Forest Program at Ceres, and we have a lot to share with you today. But first, a couple logistics. So first of all, the session is being recorded, and a link of the recording will be shared with everyone who registered. So if you have colleagues who are not able to join, feel free to pass that along to them. We will have time for audience Q&A later in the agenda. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And lastly, if you do need closed captioning, you can select that option in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Before we get started, I do need to provide you with a disclaimer. You can go to the next slide. First, competition and antitrust law prohibits agreements and concerted practices that have the object or effect of preventing, restricting, or distorting competition. Ceres does not require or seek collective decision-making or action with respect to production, operations, or other activities. Ceres facilitates the exchange of public information, but participants must not share or exchange non-public, competitively sensitive information and avoid coordination of strategic behavior that affects competition. Lastly, for any participants who are investors or asset managers, Ceres does not require or seek collective decision-making with respect to acquiring, holding, disposing, and/or voting of securities. All decisions by any investor participants are at their sole discretion and made in their individual capacities. I'll leave this up for a couple more seconds to allow folks to read it. Okay, let's move on. Before we begin today, I'd like to take the time to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous people in the US and globally who have stewarded their lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. We do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. And specific to Ceres, our office headquarters is in Boston and is on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. For today's event, we have a great lineup of speakers. We have Katie Anderson, who is Senior Director, Business, Food and Forest at the Environmental Defense Fund. As Senior Director, Katie works to catalyze the food and agriculture industry to set ambitious climate goals and implement strategies for improving environmental outcomes at scale. Katie has nearly a decade of experience advising companies on how to reduce the climate impacts of their global supply chains, with a particular focus on reducing methane, the topic of our webinar, and nitrous oxide emissions, and stopping tropical deforestation. Katie has a Master's of Environmental Management from Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. We're also joined by Marcus Willert. He's an independent sustainability expert with experience in both in-field and strategic responsible sourcing and ESG stewardship spanning environmental and social issues. He was most recently Vice President of Responsible Investment at Columbia Threadneedle Investments, covering consumer staples and leading the cross-sector work on labor standards and supply chain due diligence. Prior to that, he spent 13 years developing and managing responsible sourcing programs, including 7 years based in China. Marcus holds a postgraduate certificate in sustainable business from the University of Cambridge and an MSc in economics and business from the Stockholm School of Economics. Lastly, we're joined by Carolyn Ching, who's Director of Research for the Food and Forest Program at Ceres. Carolyn oversees research on the climate impacts of agriculture and commodity-driven deforestation and how food companies can reduce the material risks associated with those impacts. She also supports research to drive corporate action and ambition on addressing nature loss. Prior to joining Ceres, she spent 8 years at Vera, where she developed guidance and methodologies for estimating the greenhouse gas mitigation impacts of practices in the agriculture and forestry sectors. She holds a Master's in Environmental Science and Management from the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us. To go into our agenda for today, we have a great agenda. We'll start with an overview from Carolyn of the newly released report, Unlocking Opportunity, Addressing Livestock Methane to Build Resilient Food Systems, that came out last week. And at some point, we'll pop the link into the chat, so anyone who wants to take a look at that report can do so. Then we'll have a discussion with Marcus and Katie, facilitated by Carolyn. And after that, we'll have time to answer your questions before we wrap up. With that, I will hand it over to Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Meryl, and good morning, good afternoon, and hello to everyone on today's webinar. Before I dive into the report, I do want to give a quick overview of Ceres. We are an advocacy organization working to solve the global sustainability challenges of climate change, water scarcity and pollution, and nature and biodiversity loss. And we work with the world's most influential investors and companies to accelerate the transition to a more clean and just and sustainable world. On the next slide, we today are introducing our report, Unlocking Opportunity, Addressing Livestock Methane to Build Resilient Food Systems. And this report is a resource for both companies and financial institutions, and it highlights how food companies can turn the challenge of addressing livestock methane into an advantage. It discusses the risks and the opportunities related to addressing methane emissions. It identifies the sub-industries in the food sector that face the greatest methane risk exposure. It highlights strategies that those companies can take to address methane, and it also includes a number of practices that leading companies are taking. For financial institutions, there is a framework for engaging companies on those methane emissions. So we're focusing on methane because it is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And because methane has a shorter lifespan of 12 years compared to over 100 years for carbon dioxide, reducing methane today will result in a cooling effect within the next 12 years. Whereas the lag time for realizing the effects of reducing carbon dioxide is much longer. So to achieve a rapid and also long-lasting control of our global average temperature, we need to concurrently reduce carbon dioxide and methane emissions at the same time. Methane emissions are significant from only a few industries. Agriculture, which is the section of the pie that is popped out on the right side of your screen. Energy from oil, gas, and coal. And then also landfills are the other primary sources of methane emissions. Agriculture is the single largest emitter of methane, with most of ag methane coming from enteric fermentation, which is the digestion happening in livestock, and also from manure. Within the food sector, on the next slide, thank you, agriculture contributes about 44% of the sector's total emissions. That's, again, the section that's popped out on this pie chart. And then within that, you can see that methane from livestock contributes to 20% of the food sector's total emissions. So the methane portion is the orange colored pie of the popped out area. Because methane has such an outsized contribution to food companies' overall greenhouse gas footprint, and because of its potency, which we were just talking about, near-term action on methane is one of the most effective ways to address the business challenges that is created by the impacts of worsening heat waves, flood, drought, and also storms. So it's well known by now that climate change poses a business risk to food companies and their investors and lenders. And food companies that source livestock are particularly exposed to a number of risks if they're unable, in particular, to mitigate those methane emissions. So these risks include operational risk, regulatory, reputational, litigation, and market risks. But today I'll just talk through a few of them. Companies face operational risk because climate change poses a direct threat to livestock health and productivity. Climate change disrupts feedability and reduces the quality of the feed. It increases heat stress for cattle or livestock in general. It contributes to the spreading of diseases. It also causes higher mortality during extreme weather events. And just by way of example, in 2024, the US beef herd hit a historic low because of rising temperatures and drought. So overall, climate change affects yield and it increases prices. Companies can also face reputational risk. And this happens as consumers and investors are increasingly aware of the environmental impacts of meat and milk production, and they want to see food companies address their negative impacts, including their methane emissions. A lack of a plan to reduce emissions and the lack of public disclosure about how the company is taking action can open up the company to reputational risk and potentially accusations of greenwashing. And then market risk occurs as consumers are choosing brands that align with their beliefs. So companies that source livestock and they're failing to adapt to changing consumer demand to reduce emissions, those companies risk losing market share. And similarly, suppliers that fail to address the emissions and methane of their products might be at risk of losing contracts when they don't meet their customers' sustainability standards. Throughout the food value chain, companies that source dairy, beef, and pork face varying degrees of methane-related climate risk based on the products that the company offers. And it is important to understand which food companies face the greatest methane exposure in order to appropriately manage that climate risk. So this graphic shows how different sub-industries in the food sector are exposed to livestock methane emissions. In our research, we found that regardless of where a company sits in the value chain, if they primarily offer dairy, beef, or pork products, they have a relatively high exposure to methane emissions. Packaged foods and meats companies, and particularly those that focus on the packaged meats segment, have the highest exposure. But that being said, even companies with a diversity of product offerings, they also have medium to medium high exposure. The relatively high exposure is because methane emissions are so potent. So even when there is a diversity of product offerings, methane from livestock can have a relatively significant contribution to a company's total greenhouse gas footprint. So as you can see from this graphic, for companies that primarily offer dairy, beef, or pork, methane can be 50% or higher of their total emissions. And even in food retail, where the product offerings are very diverse, methane emissions from livestock can still be relatively high. So a company's approach to reducing methane from their supply chain needs to be tailored for success based on a number of different factors, including the company's position in the value chain, their size, their location, and of course, their ambition to act on climate change. But the steps that I've outlined here are applicable to all companies. So the first is that companies should assess and disclose their total greenhouse gas emissions as well as their methane emissions. And it's important to identify the largest driver of their methane emissions. This is going to help companies target where their actions can be. Enteric fermentation and manure management tend to be the sources for dairy and beef, and manure management tends to be the source for pork. Companies should also set emission reduction targets because those are critical for ensuring that the company has an internal governance approach and a process for tracking. And companies can also consider setting targets for addressing methane specifically. So targeting methane emissions, just based on the charts that we had just walked through, can be an effective way for a company to achieve their climate goals because methane can be such a large portion of a company's overall emission. As a next step, companies should create a climate transition action plan that focuses on those largest drivers of emissions. And for addressing livestock, key strategies that should be part of that transition plan are steps like engaging the supply chain, working to accelerate innovation, and then advocating for public policy. We'll talk more about these different strategies with our panelists today. And then finally, it's important that companies are transparently disclosing information about all of these different things, their emissions, their targets, and their climate transition plan. So it doesn't really matter where companies are on their journey to addressing their emissions. There are actually entry points for addressing methane, regardless of that. For companies that are just getting started, they can start by addressing their hotspots, which might be methane from livestock. They can do things like setting targets and starting to think about some elements of a transition plan. For companies that have an existing transition plan, but they might not be currently addressing methane, they can start to take action on methane. And in fact, addressing methane could be a way that would allow them to meet a substantial portion of their targets. So those companies can think about increasing the ambition of their targets and also their business goals. And companies with transition plans that address methane already, those companies are leading the way. And we absolutely encourage those companies to strive for maximum ambition and also cutting edge climate action. So there's a list here of all of the different steps that companies could be taking depending on where they are on their climate journey. And as you can see, it doesn't really matter where they are. There are ways to sort of on-ramp towards addressing methane today. And so with that, I will pass back to Meryl, and we can get started on our panel.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Great insights from that report. So let's bring up our speakers. As a reminder, we have Katie Anderson from EDF and Marcus Willard, who's an independent sustainability consultant formerly at Columbia Threadneedle. And just a reminder to our audience, after our guided discussion, we will have Q&A, so feel free to put questions into the Q&A box. So I will hand it back to our panelists.
Thank you, Meryl, and welcome to Katie and Marcus.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
So let's see, Marcus, I'm going to start with you. And it would be really great if you could help us set the scene today for why an investor should care about addressing livestock methane.
Absolutely. Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So from the investment point of view, obviously understanding and managing risk in the investment process is crucial. And that's why, we've seen during these decades, ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance factors have been integrated a lot more. And the assessment goes both on sector and company level. And when the performance of companies in the food sector, as we're talking about, is so dependent on nature, but then also so contributing to nature and climate impacts, but also then so exposed to them as well, as you mentioned, Caroline, the operative disruptions, the livestock health, extreme weather, as we've been seeing. I think it's especially pertinent. I think also it's worth reflecting on the view of food companies from the consumer point of view. So food is obviously very close to all of us. We need it to survive. But a lot of people also don't know what the food system actually looks like. And I think, frankly, some might be a little bit shocked by seeing it up close. So I think also if you're looking at the future, I think looking at a potential backlash, perhaps the food system kind of losing its, or food manufacturers kind of losing a little bit of the halo in a way, could have some really reputational risks that could then, bring down the returns for investors, both short term and long term. So investors need to be very conscious that also that and a very efficient supply chain in the food sector, which companies have been fantastically successful at managing, with lower prices per calorie than we've ever seen, also leads to perhaps a lack of resilience. And that is something that we have seen now during COVID, for example. We've seen now in shifts of geopolitics as well. So resilience is really crucial. So all of that to say, just setting the scene kind of, specifically around methane, I think the introduction of the land use emissions of flag targets, the methane initiatives as well, I think we've seen that the awareness is growing. If I would look at a company's climate transition action plan, and methane, and then I know methane is a key proportion of that, but not having a specific approach to it, I think that would raise a pretty big red flag. And maybe a part in that if that is underinvested in, it would take a long time to kind of catch up, because compared to, say, energy emissions, these are slightly different and sometimes more challenging to get a hold of. And indeed, they need the transformation, I would say, of the entire value chain. And that leads on then to, I think, the regulatory challenges here. So we are looking very much now, again, geopolitical kind of instability. We don't know what's going to happen with the global trade order that we have been relying on. Food security always keys. In the end, that's kind of what topples regimes traditionally. So very much focus for regulators, but at the same time, climate targets and the transition to a more sustainable food sector. So this might not happen in a very gradual way. It might happen, quite rapidly when these things really come into play. So that is something that you're looking at companies in terms of, and we can talk about this a bit more, like in the particular details, but how they are looking at this, how they're communicating it, how they are organizing internally and setting up incentives, and also engaging, I think, in the public policy aspects to really make sure that they are ahead of this. I think those are really the key things for us as, in the investor community to understand and to be on top of, to be able to adequately assess the risk exposure for individual companies in the sector.
Thanks, Marcus. I mean, that's great. I mean, you really kind of put all of the context around some of the risks that I was describing, but like kind of really brought to forefront how all of these things are interconnected and how both in the short term and long term, they really can be a problem. So it is a reason for investors to really pay attention to. Katie, let me switch, excuse me, let me switch to you. In your role at EDF, you have for a very long time now worked with companies on addressing emissions. And when you engage companies, how do you highlight why food companies need to care about methane emissions from livestock?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of the same things that Marcus and you, Carolyn, shared, right? I think climate change action is a business opportunity. And I think we really need to make sure that's first and foremost. This isn't climate because we care about the climate. This is climate because stable weather is critical to being able to create a long-term business strategy that will work. So to me, that's core. And then I think that means it's both about managing risks, which I think you all have done a really nice job summarizing, right? Operational risks, market risks, regulatory risks, reputational risks. And so these companies that have significant methane emissions need to be thinking about that and need to be having really robust plans in place to manage those risks. But I think the thing I can add is this is also about opportunity, right? The opposite side of risk is capturing market share and grabbing at new opportunities that are going to come through. We have future consumers who are going to be caring about this. And I think companies who are able to demonstrate progress and show that value, you have an opportunity to capture more market share with that future consumer. So I think you need to think about, when I think about this with companies, and the companies that I think are most forward-leaning are both thinking about risk and also opportunity in that business case. And I think that's really a helpful thing to flag as well. And then, methane emissions, like you said, they are the core material climate issue for companies that have a lot of beef and dairy in their portfolio. And so to me, you go from, okay, climate is material, and then methane is material, and then now what do you do about it? And I think we're really seeing more and more companies in the what do you do about it category, which I'm excited about as we've progressed on this topic.
Yeah, no, and it's very exciting to hear. And also, I appreciate that you flagging that there are opportunities here. In order to address this, there is an opportunity for companies to take advantage of what's changing in our market. Marcus, which companies are investors engaging on methane?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, actually, because your mind might go straight to the ones that have the direct production. But we also know that the food supply chain is very complex. You might think that animals are just reared in one place and all the way to slaughter, but we also know that they go through several stages before they even reach that stage. So short answer is maybe the entire value chain in a way. I mean, we're certainly commodities companies, of course, with high exposure to these kind of emissions. And then the food producers themselves, some of them are more vertically integrated than others. But even the ones who are just buying the products, obviously, if there's a lot of meat and dairy, for example, you come up to supermarkets because they often set the trends. Several of them are quite progressive, I think, and they put really strict requirements on their supply chains and suppliers. So they already have an in there, and obviously they know the supply chains really well. And then you have restaurants and food service companies, and some of them also provide for public procurement. So there's that part as well when you have public bodies who set specific requirements. So you take this entire value chain into perspective, and then you look individually at companies and subsectors and think which ones have more exposure here. And then you go on to have a quick look or look at them more deeply to see, how they are prepared. But I think it's really important to take that kind of value chain engagement perspective to make sure that the incentives are aligned, that we as well as investors understand also where there are potential roadblocks, conflicting incentives, and understand how they can hinder the transition to lower emissions. And of course, you would also look at your internal holdings. But I think one thing more I would add here is just the enablers. So when you talk to companies that provide various kind of input factors, so feed additives, for example, just to understand where are they at, how much of this is something that is quite on the fringe, what are things that are very close to large scale, and then go back to these companies who be their customers and see what kind of readiness is there to actually implement this on a larger scale. So that would be kind of the mindset, at least in my head, in terms of picking engagement companies.
No, I really appreciate that, because I think, the mind automatically thinks, like you said, maybe focus on those upstream companies where the impact is immediate, but making sure that we're aligned within the value chain with the same messages on reducing emissions is very critical for unlocking those barriers. And then there's different ways that each company can be addressing these things. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit, Marcus, about what it is that we expect companies to do for addressing methane?
Sure. And on a general level, I think it's any other kind of business challenge. You want to understand how they are getting to the strategy, really. So engagement, I think, is really key here, because you can read a lot of disclosure, but what we don't see from disclosure is the whole process, all the roads not taken, and the discussions behind that. And I think that's really important if you want to understand how companies operate and how they just organize themselves internally as well. So, but look at then at an overall strategy. So of course, how they assess the emissions here, although slight caveat as well. I think sometimes the assessment process maybe goes a little bit too long. I think there's case to be made to take in action sooner sometimes. But then how they translate into an action plan, an emission strategy. And I think here is a really key thing, especially when you have such a complex supply chain as in the food sector, is just how are you going to get your suppliers to actually do this, and what is the readiness of them to actually accomplish this? Because it's very easy for me to set a plan and say, everyone just do as I say. But the world is not that simple. So there has to be a bit of realism and also an understanding of what kind of engagement has been going on before this. And then as we're talking about here, the material emissions, the subgroups kind of really identified and with a particular and effective approach to that, and the target setting around that. I am always very curious about the governance aspect of it as well, like who signed off on this and who is actually involved. Because we know that these things, well, my assumption anyway, that, we should really think of this as quite a radical transformation and not just one thing where you draw down emissions as one particular aspect of it. That means that there will be a corresponding kind of diversity of stakeholders on the inside of a company. So that's the governance and making sure that there is an oversight there that actually gets the different parts of the organization together and working together under the appropriate incentives is really key. So that's something that I always want to keep a close eye on as well.
I love it. Thank you for flagging governance as well. Yeah. Katie, to pass to you, and maybe you have something to complement what Marcus has already talked about. What do you think companies need to do to be addressing their methane emissions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Marcus talked really nicely about kind of how you create the action plan, how you build the governance structure around that action plan. and how, you know, the disclosure element of that. I think those are all really critical pieces. But I think within the action plan, right, what are the elements that need to be included and need to be considered? And so from our perspective, and Ceres also teed it up nicely in the report, you know, a core action is engaging farmers and suppliers. So we know that these emissions are sitting deep in supply chains. Sometimes, you know, this is tier 3 suppliers who you need to be thinking about how you're going to be engaging. And so a robust plan needs to consider, okay, what are the different geographical contexts in which I'm operating? What do the farm landscapes look like in those contexts? What is the tool? What are the set of tools that farmers can be using to implement? And what are the barriers to addressing those tools? Right. If we think through all of those things, then you can think about how do I then execute through my supply chain, through projects on the ground, you know, kind of through a robust set of structures, how I'm going to actually address those emissions. And I think that kind of context specific farmer engagement is, to me, the most core thing that you need to be thinking about with any sort of food system change. And that needs to be partnership focused, right? Farmers are also businesses, and there are millions of them globally, and we can't take a single kind of a one tool approach. We need to be looking really at how do we partner with farmers on that work. So I think that's one really critical element. Would love to discuss more in the panel, but I think the other two things that I'm really keen to have companies leaning in on are innovation. So how can companies leverage their own innovation engines internally and also support external innovation to ensure that we get a more robust pipeline of methane abatement opportunities over time? And that's another critical piece of work. And then finally, policy advocacy. So one company or even the biggest companies in these spaces can't drive all the change we need to manage the risks that are sitting in the company supply chains that we talked about. And so I think that means that really forward-leaning companies need to be thinking about how to step forward and use their voice appropriately to drive collective action. And where they can be proof points for what's possible that then brings forward policy to enable the whole system to shift. So those are some of the things that, you know, I think leading plans include. Understanding not everyone's there yet. I think starting with farmer engagement and supplier engagement is really critical, but then building toward what those other elements can be, I think is important over time.
Thanks, Katie. And I love the mention of policy. I do think it's important because I know, you know, we're kind of in a space right now where there is a lot of uncertainty in our political and, you know, how our global order, but engaging on policy is important. The reason that you say, and this term might be a little cliche, but it's about supporting the enabling environment for all of this change to happen. And so, you know, we keep talking about it, but the reason for it isn't just because we all need to write our senators or anything like that, but because it is important to create a level playing field for all those companies.
Well, and Carolyn, I think it's also about like the efficiency of any given company investment, right? It's about if you're investing, it's more efficient if others are also doing that. It drives down costs, it improves, you know, so I think this isn't about, it doesn't have to be political, right? It's about the enabling policy. And I think that's an important thing to consider in this specific environment.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Agree. And then you did mention this, and I would like to drill down into a little bit more. So you mentioned that partnership's important. It's important to engage farmers and suppliers. Can you speak more about that? Like, why is that important? And also, what are some of the barriers that could be that we need to kind of think about and unlock in order to really increase changes in practice and technology adoption?
Right. Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the reason it's important is because on the farm is where the emissions are. So again, if we're going to address these business risks, we need to get down to the landscapes. And that means that we need to be engaging and partnering with farmers. So, you know, to me, that's really the why. The barriers, I think it's really important, again, to take a kind of system by system look at the barriers. So For different practices, there's different barriers, and then that means that there should be different techniques to overcome those barriers. So for instance, in a more low-income country setting, there are practices that can be used, such as improving animal health, improving feed efficiency, access to water even, that can create both a reduction in methane emissions per unit of milk, but also a strong economic return to the farmer from deploying those practices. And so why are farmers not doing that? Often it's about lack of technical knowledge, lack of access to very specific inputs. You know, they don't have access to that feed ingredient. They don't have access to that vaccine or that medicine. They don't have the financial support to pay for those things, right? Or lack of labor even sometimes, right? They're doing this and they also have other jobs and they don't have the ability to invest in their business. And so in these settings, I think farmers can come and or companies can come and support with that technical assistance, you know, access to, you know, effective financial tools that are going to help them overcome those very specific input costs. But it's a different type of problem than in a more developed setting where we're seeing, you know, manure management or feed additives. These have costs that are kind of high upfront costs or consistent over time costs. And so I think in those situations, we need different kinds of financial tools that are going to support overcoming those barriers. And so that can be, you know, we can talk more about what that can look like, but I do think you need to really tailor the set of approaches you use based on that very specific geographical context. And this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, this is knowledge that people have, and you can quickly piggyback. And once companies understand where they're sourcing from, you can quickly piggyback to understanding what those opportunities are. This doesn't have to be, you know, an overwhelming amount of research or analysis. You know, just a couple of conversations, you'll be able to figure that out.
Yeah, no, that's right. These are there, and maybe this is the point we should talk more about, but there are different models that farmers have used to overcome certain barriers. And maybe, and you know, speaking about the fact that there can be some high upfront costs or consistent costs along the way, can you speak to the different financial models that could help with some farmers in being able to implement these?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, EDF, we actually worked, and I can put it in the chat if anyone's interested. We worked with Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, as well as Pinion, on a report around blueprints for different financial models that could support overcoming these different barriers. And so we looked at, I think, around 8 financial models, things like sustainability-linked loans or green loans or impact funds, where we can connect in finance alongside supply chain action to kind of catalyze more private sector investment in these types of questions. And I think so far, I personally have seen more of this innovation in the row crop space to date. So, you know, we know that Farmers Business Network has a sustainability linked loan product that they offer to farmers to help cover their operating expenses. That's one model, right? You can imagine similar types of models in these other spaces. And I think we need continued innovation and trying different options on the ground that can then, again, figure out what's scalable and then drive scale. So I can kind of share in the link that blueprint report, and I think others can dig in, and happy to discuss that more over time as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks. Marcus, do you have any thoughts on overcoming these barriers?
Yeah, sure. And if, you know, very much to Katie's point here, I mean, if you look at the sector overall, there's such a massive imbalance between the big food producers, food retailers, and then the supply chain that just, you know, continues out into the horizon with, you know, relatively small actors. So certainly thinking about the risk and the opportunity cost for farmers then in terms of introducing just new ways of working, not necessarily even just more expensive input factors, but even just to change the work. And there's a risk and there's an opportunity cost there, because at least they kind of know what works. So there's definitely, I think, a role for companies to downstream companies to step in and think around how does financing work, how does a liquidity situation look like to enable farmers to do. And I think, I mean, obviously, sitting there, I can't be an expert in every company and every supply chain. I think in some cases the knowledge might well be there, but again, to Katie's point, like they just don't have the resources to get going, or maybe even just the time. In some cases, there might be a need for a quite new way of doing things with new technical expertise and other things that are needed. So I think that really will come down from, and something that we would try to understand them from, the supply chain engagement of downstream companies, to really make sure that the practices and incentives that they put into place are really suited for that. And obviously, I mean, this obviously goes beyond just emissions. We see a number of changes that need to be done. So I think, again, coming back to this point and around when supply chains are so trimmed for efficiency, I think what has happened is also that you might have real inadvertently adverse effects of your purchasing practices as a downstream company, because they are so focused on getting the right products at the shelves at the right time. And having worked in procurement departments, I know how challenging that is. It is extremely difficult to do that. But if you pressure your supply chain too much, there's also no slack. And we have seen the results of that. So really thinking about and scrutinizing purchasing practices and engaging your supply chain in a way that can give you really frank feedback on it, feedback that might be somewhat unwelcome. And making sure that internally that you are not over incentivizing buyers to your own detriment, or to your supply chain's detriment in the long term. So that kind of stability, financing commitment, that could be, obviously prices is one part of it, but contract length, earlier volume indications, limitations on when's the latest time to change an order. All of those things create, a more resilient kind of supply chain. And I've seen this as well. I mean, when I started working in sustainable supply chains, I started in fast fashion, and there was a massive resistance to anything outside of working contract by contract, even with suppliers that I've been working on for a very long time, many years, decades in some cases. But we realized that if we were really to require a different way of working, higher standards, it was mostly labor at that point, but also some environmental issues like wastewater treatment. We had created a situation that really disincentivized suppliers to make those changes because of the risk and the opportunity cost. And that, taking all that together, all these parameters, led to a conversation on how we could start to make some volume commitments. And that really just changed the tone completely, because suddenly we had a bit of skin in the game. And again, as I said, this is really hard work. I have a massive respect for buyers in these organizations, but because of that, I also know what they're capable of. So I think sometimes when you set the framework for yourself and say, this is our commitment, they find a way of getting the stuff. So I have a lot of faith in that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. And actually, I really appreciate that answer, because Katie, I think you talked a lot about what you can do to support farmers at the producer level, but maybe not all companies feel like they have the option to do that. And so Marcus, highlighting like the opportunity for engaging other companies, your suppliers, kind of really stitches that all together. Okay, we are sort of getting close to time. So I'm going to jump and move us forward to maybe our last question. So this would be for both of you. What should investors and other stakeholders look to understand in order to see how companies are taking action on methane? Marcus, maybe I'll just start with you.
Sure. So I think as I alluded to before, I think it's the process of identifying the material issues. And that's where we come in as well. In engagement, we like to be a critical friend. So really understand the kind of logical consistency in there, and then what part of the organization that we really active in this. The planning and the strategy, of course, itself, but how they're going to measure the return on that investment in non-financial terms, so to speak. But what does it actually result in? I think so. Tracking of that kind of performance, we see pilot projects, brilliant. You should definitely try out. These are complex challenges. I think there's a role there to really test out lots of different things. I would just be very mindful to challenge companies on not getting stuck in the pilot project pit or whatever you want to call it. But make sure that there's a readiness to scale up these projects if they prove successful. And then I would just say one thing about public policy screening as well. Companies are part of lots of different industry associations. I think a real understanding of like how they lobby and what kind of policy that they are proposing, and make sure that that is just aligned with your own strategies.
Those are great. Katie?
Yeah. So I think those are great answers from Marcus. I think one thing that that EDF has been working on with companies is the dairy and with Ceres is the Dairy Methane Action Alliance. So back in 2023, we launched the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, which is really an unprecedented alliance of companies in the dairy sector who are committing to take action and improve disclosure on methane emissions specifically. So far, 8 companies have joined the alliance, and those companies have committed to publicly disclose their methane emissions as part of their climate disclosures, and also create methane-specific action plans, ideally as part of their broader climate action plans. But if they don't have a climate action plan, starting with a methane action plan because of how material it is to these companies' businesses. And so the companies are working on that. And I think that is one great step forward in kind of showing how this can work. Some of the things that Marcus and I have been discussing today in practice within real companies. That group is also, the alliance is also really thinking about how to share knowledge to action quickly, right? So there's, Marcus was talking about the governance inside of a company to ensure that they're able to actually act and deliver this work. There's also some opportunities, obviously within the confines of antitrust, to collaborate across companies to identify common barriers and try to overcome them together. So that's also an opportunity that the Alliance is working on. And I think that's something that that can be catalytic in terms of not everyone reinventing the same wheel, like creating and templatizing as much as we can across industry, I think can be incredibly helpful. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to business.edf.org/DMAA. And also you can reach out to me, or Ceres, and Carolyn's team is also very involved.
I love that you have a very easy URL. Marcus and Katie, thank you so much. There were actually many more questions that I could ask you, but to be fair to our audience, we're going to open up the floor to everyone participating today to ask their questions. And actually, a number of folks have already chimed in. So Meryl, over to you to moderate this.
Thanks, Carolyn. So this gives me a chance to direct some of these to you as well. And actually, the first one would probably be for you. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Can you talk about the methodology used to attribute methane exposure risk in the report?
Yes. So the emissions profile, so we actually also describe this in the report. The emissions profiles were estimated based on a selection of publicly disclosed emissions from companies within each of the sub-industries. And the emission data for food retail was actually sourced from a McKinsey report. And then if methane was not explicitly disclosed, then it was estimated based on the proportion of dairy, beef, and pork comprised of their total emissions, and then multiplied by 0.5, because methane is approximately 50% of livestock production emissions. So the emissions profiles are estimated, and then they're intended to assist financial institutions to identify companies with exposure to methane within their supply chains. So they're meant to be indicative.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. We have another question about traceability, and maybe I'll start with Katie on this one, but then Carolyn or Marcus, if you want to join in, please feel free to add. Can you share a bit more about what you're seeing to support companies in overcoming the traceability challenge when it comes to methane reduction in their greenhouse gas inventories?
Yes. It's a great question. I mean, these supply chains are incredibly complex, and getting visibility down to the farm can be very hard, especially in low data environments, which are many environments in the agriculture sector. So I think, we're definitely seeing increased technology being leveraged to support traceability in supply chains. And I think that is very exciting. I think, more satellite imagery and understanding where a modeling even where the geographies are that you're likely to be sourcing from if you don't have complete visibility, all the way through to kind of leverage, these novel technology approaches that are taking supply chain information and carrying it through the physical commodity to the end of the chain. So I think those are some like more technical advances. The thing that I'll say here is I think a lot of times we get really bogged down in like, I don't have perfect visibility, I cannot yet build a strategy. And I think I just really challenge everybody, what can you do today with the information you have today that would drive impact on the ground, right? And I think rather than trying to get perfect information and all the way to traceability, if you can't get that, where are you sourcing generally, and what can you be doing in those regions to get started and learn, and then eventually, as you get more information, you continue to adapt. So I think that's how I would answer that question. Others should definitely feel free to chime in, but I think getting started is more important than getting perfect traceability down to these agricultural systems.
Yeah, I would just I absolutely agree with that, and I think in the last decade or so, we've seen tremendous advances. A lot of them focused on deforestation control. So the polygons now that you get from satellite monitoring are very small. There's a lot of work being done that. But I think to Katie's point as well, in some cases, you might have a supply chain that the very upstream bit of it kind of changes a bit. That helps to address shifts in demand and other things as well. So that gives you more resilience. However, that might not mean that you always know exactly where your products come from. So some examples there, if you take another example, say working conditions and agriculture practices in the cocoa supply chain, some companies are taking much more of a community approach and saying, in this community, that's where a lot of our products come from. Which individual farm might not be so interesting at this point. So we take a community approach as well. And we also know that farmers would then trade information and actually work together to improve their practices. So I think there's something to be said there as well, instead of trying to lock it down, because the world often doesn't look like our databases and spreadsheets.
Thanks so much to both of you. Another question related to carbon insetting. Could you discuss carbon insetting, say for food companies, perhaps with dairy or manure management? Really interesting question, because we haven't yet touched on this, kind of the insetting or offsetting piece. Carolyn, do you want to start with that one? And then other folks, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, sure. I think that insetting is a great option for addressing dairy methane emissions in particular from dairy. I think, and it depends on like your model of insetting, and there's a few different ways that people are doing this. Some companies are kind of directly following the carbon credit modeling, where a project happens on the ground. They use very standard carbon credit accounting of what is your baseline, was the practice additional, what are the emission reductions, how much is that, quantifying it into a credit, and then taking that and applying it to their scope 3. There are other people who are kind of thinking about how does this change kind of overall affect the emissions of, say, my supply shed, which kind of also touches on the traceability thing. And then how does this reduce the overall emission factor for this dairy that I'm sourcing from, like, let's say, Iowa or something. And so I think that insetting is an interesting option because it gives an opportunity for companies to pay for emission reductions to happen at the farm level. And every company that would like to see scope 3 emissions go down at all levels of the supply chain can also pay into this. And so I think it's an interesting option for companies to help pool resources in order to help finance the activities that are happening on the ground level. But we do need, to do that, you'd have to have quite complex systems for managing the data and the flow of information and et cetera. But there does seem promise in a way for thinking about that model for pulling those financial resources together. I don't know if Katie, you have any thoughts on that to add?
Katie, feel free to jump in, but if not, I'll go to another question. We've got quite a few coming in. I hope we can get to a couple more. A question about the motivations at companies that are driving proactivity on methane. Are there some best examples of governance at a company? And also, what are some of the incentives and motivations within companies for acting on methane behind some of the leaders? So maybe Katie or Marcus, if you want to take this one.
I can start off perhaps. It's a tricky question in a way, because each company is different, and that's what makes governance so important to understand as well. I think on a very high level, I think it has to do with the underlying assumption of a company and what role they play in the wider economy. And that goes for investors as well. Are they there to kind of just capitalize on the shifts and developments, or are they actually stepping in and really try to affect it? And also by that, which I think sometimes the governance though comes in explicitly when they talk about ownership models. So some companies obviously are much more exposed to the challenges of the stock market, and some of them less so, and they can take perhaps longer bets. But I think, if you look at some of the companies mentioned in the report, for example, I think they really see that, we're just part of this. We're well, in a positive way, stuck with it, and we're in a position where we can both have perhaps the capital, the knowledge and the technology, but also the overview, much more than individual smaller actors, and that is something that we can utilize in order to strengthen the entire system that they also depend on.
Yeah, and then I think in terms of motivation, so I think a couple of things I would add to this. In almost every company that I see, a critical player is procurement. And then understanding how the governance of procurement is evolving and engaged is really important. So making sure that the leadership over the kind of procurement space as it connects to these material issues is engaged, aligned, and supportive, understanding that this is about future-proofing that product category for them, right? I think if to me, that's like a critical brick that can be laid and in terms of delivering value, right? And I think that business proposition for that specific function internally is really important.
Yeah, and just add one thing, just a second, is I think that's really true. And within companies that I've been part of, you can definitely see companies who have a procurement function that really goes out regularly into the real world and really spend that money to be on site, even if it's across the world, to understand things on the ground. That is such a strong indicator, I think.
Thanks so much, Marcus and Katie. Time for maybe one more quick question, and I'll direct this one to you, Katie. In the current political environment where there's less funding for climate finance, at least in the US, how do you think the market signal to incentivize companies can be created?
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting question, because I don't think that the market signal exclusively comes from a political environment. I think consumers are the market signal. And I think the future consumer is still a strong market signal for companies. And so to me, that preparation, companies, yes, we need to, they're thinking a lot about short-term financial, reporting and all of those real constraints. But they also are thinking about, how am I going to be a successful company in 10 years? Or, the smart forward-leaning companies are thinking about that. And these consumers are indeed sending market signals, right, that are going to be important. And so to me, yes, the political headwinds are real. They are complicated. That is a challenge. But what I've said to someone said to me, companies are it's like a snow day, right? In terms of those headwinds, your homework will still come due, right? We know that these risks are still coming. This is not a forever situation. And I think understanding that and continuing to lean in to do that homework is going to make you best positioned over the long term.
Thanks, Katie. I think that's a
And-
great metaphor for the first day of spring. So yeah, the homework is still going to come due, even though we've had some snow days.
I love, Meryl, may I just jump in really quickly? Because we also had a question that was about how is this complementary to other organizations that focus on consumer behavior? And I think that that's a perfect example of how these are complementary. We do need to drive down our methane emissions. And at the same time, we do need to think about that the organizations that think about changing consumer behavior are very complementary to it.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. My favorite panels are the ones where I have to rein in my speakers and everyone wants to chime in. So thank you all so much. Thanks especially to our speakers for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. I will put the link to the report again in the chat so you can download that. We do have a couple other events coming up that I want to highlight. On March 24th, if we can bring the slides back up, we're partnering with Ecolab for an event on how AI is helping tech companies promote water circularity in their operations. And on March 26th, we'll be joined by representatives from Cardano, Bunge, and Intelligence to learn about how companies are leveraging new technology and satellite data to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains, which is the other large chunk of emissions that you saw earlier. And then if you're in Boston or will be this fall, I hope you join us at the iconic JFK Presidential Library for our annual fundraiser, Evening with Ceres. And then lastly, you can download all of our reports at ceres.org reports, where you can see the latest, including the report we discussed today. So thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic webinar. If you want to provide feedback, you can use the QR code that you see on your screen, and we do welcome that. And thanks so much for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie and Marcus.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.